Hello and welcome to Jesuitical, a podcast from American Media for saints and sinners. You can join us each week for honest conversations about the Catholic Church and our world today, sometimes over drinks. I'm Ashley McKinless, and I'm joined once again by Zac Davis.
Ashley, it is great to be here. I don't know where I am, what time it is, what day of the week it is. Pretty sleep deprived, but thrilled to be here.
It's great to have you back. It was pretty lonely in the studio, even though Sebastian did a great job. It was great to have him. It's very good to have you back.
He did do really well. I'm glad that he didn't do too well.
Yeah.
Because I do like this. I do enjoy podcasting. I did listen. You guys did great.
Thank you.
Very, very happy to be back, though.
And for those listeners who might be new to the show, Zac was on paternity leave for the past month. So how's parenthood, Zac?
It's the best. I mean, I'll talk a little bit more about it during our faith sharing segment, but my wife and I are just in love with our daughter, Madeline Marie.
She's pretty darn cute.
She's so cute. I'm biased, but I think she's the cutest baby. Would vote for her for Baby of the Year.
Yeah.
I found out that is a real competition.
Is it?
Yeah. I don't think I'm going to enter her, but she would win. No, we're good, and she sometimes gives us good chunks of sleep through the night.
Yeah.
So, we're hanging in there. I will say paternity leave is such a gift. I cannot imagine having to try to podcast badly and also learn how to be a parent at the same time. But I am hoping that listeners pray extra hard for my wife, Amanda, who is doing her first couple of solo parenting days this week. I'll go back on leave early next year when her leave runs out. But grateful to American Media and to you and to all my colleagues for letting me take that really special time.
Yeah, and for the foreseeable future, Jesuitical will be over coffee.
It's over coffee right now. And the caffeine intake has increased dramatically.
All right, but back to this week's show. We are talking about foreign debt relief. We're still in the Jubilee Year that was called by Pope Francis, and kind of one of the main themes of Jubilee in its biblical roots is the forgiveness of debts. And we're talking about debt relief with Dean Detloff. He's a research and advocacy officer at Development and Peace for Caritas Canada. That's like their version of Catholic Relief Services. And he's a real expert in this field.
Yeah, that's right. So we're not talking in this instance about sort of personal debt, whether that be student loan or medical debt, but that's very important also. But sort of bilateral debt, that is debt between countries. I learned a ton on this episode about why this is such a big deal and why it's a matter of justice that the Catholic Church is interested in and why it is a focus of a lot of Catholic organizations this Jubilee Year.
Yeah, because we're in this situation where, perversely, the poorest countries are often the ones who owe money to richer countries like the United States or European nations, and paying that debt diverts resources from taking care of their own educational and health needs, what they need to, investing in their people so that they can become richer countries. Yeah, so stick around for that conversation with Dean, but first we have Signs of the Times, the part of our show where we sift through the Catholic news of the week so you don't have to. And we're going to start by talking about the memorial service that happened on Sunday for Charlie Kirk. Mourners packed into two stadiums in Arizona for the service, and it was attended by the who's who of the conservative movement. So President Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, several members of the cabinet, and other GOP lawmakers. But I would say our attention should go to Charlie's widow, Erica Kirk, who I think gave the most moving speech of the evening.
Yeah, I agree. I was deeply moved when she got up there and announced that she forgave the young man that killed her husband. And, I think she has rightly gotten a lot of praise from across the political spectrum. I think that is the heart of Christianity, right? A weeping widow forgiving her husband's killer. It's, this selfless act of mercy that I should say has already manifested practically. Because she said in an interview with the New York Times that she's not going to advocate for the death penalty for her husband's killer. That will be up to the state what ultimately happens. But I think that action and those words, they should speak loudly to a country that is really fiercely divided right now.
Yeah. And unfortunately, this profound witness to, what it means to be a Christian was couched in other speeches that were frankly pretty disturbing and political and had very little to do with Christianity. Right after Erica spoke, Donald Trump was given the podium. He was the last one to speak. And he contradicted everything Erica had just said. He said, sorry, but unlike Erica and Charlie, I don't love my enemies. I hate them.
He just... what a perfect counterexample, and perfect. I mean, perfect in that it is perfectly clear. I just feel that the president has, time and time again, especially in this event, shown himself to be unworthy of the office for leadership and unifying a country in a tense moment, and ratcheting up the violence. But to get up there after a widow has just proclaimed forgiveness for her husband's killer, and to talk about how you think that's weakness and that you really prefer to hate your opponents, I was disturbed, sadly not surprised. As you said, it's a shame that was the last thing. That was sort of the last word. There was a lot at the memorial to sort of both memorialize Charlie Kirk, but also, as our colleague Father Sam Sawyer wrote in America Magazine this week, sort of canonize him the way we would understand it in the Catholic sense, sort of build up Mr. Kirk to this saint-like figure, but mostly for the conservative movement, which I know has got a lot of reactions from people.
Yeah, this service really was kind of one part evangelical mega church service and then one part kind of Turning Point USA MAGA rally, and those two parts of it converged on the figure of Charlie Kirk, who, as you said, is becoming kind of like a martyr figure or saint, as we would say as Catholics. And kind of surprisingly, even some Catholic bishops have kind of contributed to this, specifically Bishop Robert Barron and Cardinal Timothy Dolan. Bishop Barron referred to Charlie Kirk as, I think it was an apostle of civil discourse, and Cardinal Dolan called him kind of a modern-day St. Paul in his efforts to talk about Jesus and evangelize the culture. I think both of some people appreciated those comparisons, and a number of Catholics found it a bit off-putting because it did not recognize the really bad things that Charlie Kirk has said and kind of just swept those under the rug.
As you mentioned on the show last week with Sam and JD, it's not, to not speak ill of the dead is an act of charity. However, I don't think that act extends itself to, publicly heaping praise in the media upon someone, right? You don't have to do that. But I think people were rightly critical of not just this specific Catholic context, but this also in the effort at the memorial to conflate this conservative activism in Christian identity in a way where the lines get really blurry really quickly. And I think even if you say, preface it, which a lot of people did, I didn't agree with everything Charlie Kirk said or did. Some of the things are bad enough that you kind of have to point those out specifically in some instances, especially if you're a public figure making a public statement. Otherwise, people
about comparing them to, or saying he's a saint.
Yeah, if you're saying he's a saint, it's you have to point out some of the things he said that were, frankly racist and sexist and really harmful to a number of communities. Otherwise, people are kind of left thinking, did you either, one, not know about those things or find them sort of tolerable or excusable because Charlie Kirk would often say nice things about his Christian faith.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty, I share that reaction. I think it's one that a lot of people are having.
Yeah, and our colleague, editor of America, Father Sam Sawyer, wrote a piece about this, asking the question, who is served by this effort to make Charlie Kirk a saint? And, is it the gospel, or is it
the conservative movement,
Trump, GOP, Turning Point USA? And he comes down, I think, in that it's not the gospel. So we'll link to that piece in the show notes and you can check it out. But moving on to our next story, we're going to turn our attention to the Christians in Nigeria. Nigeria, I think, is probably safe to say, or not safe to say, is the most dangerous place to be a Christian in the world right now.
Yeah, that's right. And this is, I think, a story that's been under noticed in the media. There are definitely a lot of people, including at America, who are reporting on this and talking about it, but it doesn't always get the most clicks. But it's super important. Right now, the church in Nigeria is mourning the death of Father Matthew Iya, who was killed in what appears to be an execution-style shooting on September 19th in Enugu State there. And this killing is part of a broader trend of threats and violence against not just Catholics, but all Christians in Nigeria.
Yeah, so according to a report released in August, 7,000 Christians were killed in Nigeria just in the first 220 days of 2005, and another 8,000 were kidnapped over that same period. So it's really an epidemic, and it started really in the early 2000s when Boko Haram established itself in Nigeria, wanting to proclaim a caliphate. And so there's this religious component to it, but there's also an economic and climate change component to it.
Yeah, that's right. In June, Pope Leo specifically called out and prayed for Christians in Nigeria after there was an attack where over 200 people were sort of brutally killed in this village-wide attack, also in Enugu State. Most of people who were internally displaced and sheltered by the local Catholic mission there. As you mentioned, Nigerian government claims that it's not necessarily like a religious persecution alone, but a lot of advocates and nonprofit groups say that that is definitely a component of it. That the government is saying that it's also it's over land use conflict, ethnic tensions. But I think, the answer could be yes, it's all of that, right? And, in Enugu State, this happens to be what's called Nigeria's breadbasket. It's a very fertile area. And when you have these like increased weather patterns, major weather events, you have internal migration, higher temperatures make whatever land is farmable, that changes. And so you have natural conflicts when there are resources and scarce resources and people's fighting over them, that it makes, I think, religious tensions a lot easier to accept. And I think this is why in the Catholic Church's teaching about the environment, about climate change, it says that like all of these things are connected, right? Yeah. Like, and the church is concerned most especially about what happens to the poor. Pope Francis said all the time that it's the poor who have to pay the price for climate change. And I think this is just one example of that.
Yeah, that's right. And it's actually something we get into with Dean. He talks about, monetary debt being connected to ecological debt. The developed world used all the carbon and got rich, and now the poorer countries are left to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, that comes up again in our conversation with Dean Detloff later on. But before that, what's our next story?
Yeah, so our next story is about a group of nuns in Austria that have created quite a media firestorm. So in early September, 3 Austrian nuns aged 81, 86, and 88 broke out of their retirement home where they had been for almost 2 years, and with the help of a former student and a locksmith broke into their former abbey, which was a castle from the Middle Ages that was just 5 miles down the road from this retirement home.
Yeah, so this story requires some unpacking.
Yeah.
Much like the sisters are doing in their new old home. They're the only living members of their order, so they're the last 3. And there are some church rules that say that religious order has to have, I think it's like 5 living members. And so because of that, and because I think this medieval castle was sort of becoming difficult to keep up, the superior who had sort of taken over their care, who we should say is a man, an abbot, ordered them to move to a nearby retirement community that was filled with, I think, not just women, but also priests and other
and run by Franciscan sisters. And there is some dispute between the sisters and this abbot. They say they were forced to go. He says that the sisters agreed to the move. But what's not in dispute is that once the sisters got there, they were miserable. They said they've told media that the rooms were small. They missed their garden back at the old castle. And interestingly, they said they're having to share meals with men, which is something they hadn't done in decades during their time as religious sisters.
Yeah, it's It's interesting. I think there's one part of you when you hear this story to go, oh, that's so cute. These nuns broke out of their unhappy conditions.
It does sound like it could be like Sister Act 5.
Yeah, the finale. But like also it's a pretty common story, I think, about aging. You have people who are, one group says, you guys agreed to this. You guys agreed to move. And they're like, no, we didn't. We didn't agree to move out of our home. I think a lot of people can relate to that. Anyone who's cared for someone elderly and who needs some more intensive care. But once it seems like they just sort of walked out the front door, and some former students drove them back to their monastery in the castle, where they found that the electricity had been turned off and the refrigerator needed to be plugged back in once they got the electricity back on. But it seems like it's a big place. There's only 3 of them living there, but it's where they took vows, right? Like the type of vows they took were to a community and also to a place. When they made those vows, I think they expected to sort of live out their days there. So I am sympathetic to this thought that, like, is there anything that can be done to allow them to stay? It seems like right now they're just kind of being left alone there.
Yeah.
And this group of like former students right now are taking care of them or helping take care of them.
Yeah, bringing them meals, providing them with company. They installed security cameras, that sort of thing. And according to the abbot, this castle really was in precarious condition. So I think that he was probably acting with the sister's best interest in mind. And now a spokesperson for the abbot has said, because of kind of the media attention on these nuns, who are very sympathetic figures, they've even started an Instagram account that has 50,000 followers.
If you want to follow it, it's Nonin_Goldenstein.
Yes, which is the name of the abbey. They feel like their hands are tied. Like, it's not going to look good if they evict these nuns against their will again, maybe.
Yeah, especially because, just to transition to our next story, they could live for another 25 years even.
That's true.
Speaking of our next story, Sister Jean Dolores Schmidt, BVM, is retiring from on-campus work at Loyola University Chicago, my alma mater. A couple things. One, Sister Jean, famous for most people because she was the chaplain of the men's basketball team there when they went on their Final Four run. She was featured frequently and prominently as like the school's mascot and best representative. But she's been on this show before, and so longtime listeners of the show will note that she's an old friend of mine. She used to host the Tuesday night prayer group that I went to when I was a student there. And I need people to stop sending me the story about her retiring, because I keep, like, every single time it's just like a big photo of Sister Jean in a New York Times article, and I think she's dead. And that's kind of distressing.
Understandable. You left out kind of the most important part, is that she's retiring at age 106.
Yes. And, when I was a student there, she was in her 90s, and she worked harder than I ever have. She was going up across campus, down to the downtown campus, up to the Lakeshore campus.
Going to the basketball games.
Yeah, carrying her own groceries. I mean, and even just a couple of years ago had an office right in the middle of the student center and regularly was seeing students, counseling them, talking to them. She is an absolute legend, a hero of mine. And Sister Jean, I hope you're able to take some time, focus on your health and your comfort, and we are praying for you. And
I'm sure she is still praying for all the students at Loyola.
Speaking, one last little thing. Someone sent me a Loyola onesie for Madeline here to the office. It didn't come with a note. I have no idea who sent it. So if that was anyone listening to this podcast, please reach out and let me know. You can email jesuitical@americamedia.org or find my email if you have it.
Love that. All right, now stick around for our conversation with Dean Detloff about foreign debt forgiveness. Joining us from Toronto is Dean Detloff. Dean is the Research and Advocacy Officer at Development and Peace, Caritas Canada. Welcome to Jesuitical, Dean.
Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here.
It's great to chat with you. I'm especially interested in learning about this because I owe Ashley about $47.
And I'm not a forgiving person.
She is not. But more seriously, you've been working on this topic of debt relief for a long time, but I'm wondering if we can just start at maybe like a 101 level. why is the church concerned with this? Do we have what's the basis for debt relief in Scripture? How long has the church been involved?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think that the call for debt relief is actually an extremely ancient and very significant part of what it means to be a Christian person, but also in the deeper biblical tradition into the Old Testament. And it's a part that we've maybe let ourselves forget over the years in history, and we've sort of built a whole system that makes it very hard to remember that piece of our faith. But it is integral. It first appears in the Bible in Leviticus 25 and Deuteronomy 15, where there's this commandment to have a Jubilee year every 50 years. And there's sort of three big pieces of that year. Slaves are set free, land is allowed to rest, and then debts are canceled. And throughout the biblical story, the tradition of Jubilee takes on more and more significance. It's a bit of a snowball. So by the time you get to the prophets, the Jubilee year is also kind of a symbol for the oppressed going free more broadly. And it reaches a high point in Luke 4 when Jesus announces himself. It's his first public speech. And he reads a Jubilee passage from the book of Isaiah declaring a year of the Lord's favor, which is a Jubilee year. So I always like to say the Jubilee is actually Jesus's manifesto. It's his kind of announcement. This is what I'm here to do in the world. And nevertheless, we've kind of forgotten that piece, even though it is so pivotal to Jesus's ministry. In the Catholic Church, where we have sort of an ordinary Jubilee that's on schedule every 25 years, you can have an extraordinary one too. There was one in 2016. But every 25 years, we have a scheduled one. And one way that we've recovered that debt cancellation piece is that in 2000, the world was in a huge debt crisis. And at the time, Pope John Paul II had recognized there was all this organizing going on trying to get debt relief for countries, especially in the global south. And he made a point to integrate that piece into the spiritual Jubilee year in 2000. And Pope Francis has done the same in his own papal bull, Spes Non Confundit, talking about the Jubilee this year, again, calling on affluent countries to cancel the debt. So it's a big piece that, we find first in Scripture, but then makes its way through history. And especially in this century, the Church has made debt relief a key piece of a Jubilee year.
Dean, I'm curious what you would say to someone who might look at the instances in Scripture where debt relief is called for and point out that the global economy looks very different today than it did back then, and maybe that we don't need to be so literal in following some of these commands.
Yeah, well, it's true. The global economy does look very different than it did in the ancient world, in ancient Israel, or in ancient Rome. And it is much more complex, and the way that wealth is generated and distributed is different than it was back then. But I think that in many ways, the Jubilee call to kind of create space to talk about the bad consequences of debt is more relevant now than it would have been even in the ancient world. These days, whole countries, that are responsible for millions and millions of people end up being in debt situations that ask them to make impossible choices like, should I pay back my creditor, my foreign creditor, or should I invest in healthcare or education? And I'll just give you one example. The United Nations says that over 3 billion people live in countries that spend more on the interest of their debt, so the profit of their debt, than on either healthcare or education. And I think it's important for us to recover that Jubilee impulse to say, well, what is it about debt that feels like every once in a while it kind of gets out of control? Like there's this biblical intuition that maybe debt is the kind of thing you have to keep tabs on or keep an eye on. And it provided that moment of reset. And we do have a bit of a precedent. Like I mentioned, in 2000, the Jubilee did achieve some debt cancellation, over $130 billion for 36 different countries. There's lots to say about it. Not totally clean. There's complications and so on. But I think that it would be wrong to get ourselves off the hook by saying the economy is more complicated. And in fact, the opposite would be true. It is so complicated that Jubilee demand is more important for us today than it ever has been.
So how did that work in 2000? I know that Pope John Paul II made it a priority for him, but the church is no longer a temporal power that can force governments to forgive debt. Maybe at some point in our history, it was a lot easier for the church to be influential in that regard. But how did it work in 2000 with the church kind of pushing governments to relieve these debts?
In 2000, there was this big push from the church, but also civil society calling for debt cancellation. And how that happens, how debt could be canceled, was a big open question at the time. There were lots of proposals from civil society, proposals from creditors, from states. There was a recognition, I think, around the globe that at least there was a debt problem. There was a crisis and something had to be done about it. So there were debates. But in the end, what happened was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, set up what's called the HIPC initiative. This is kind of alphabet soup, but it's the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative is what they called it. And through that process, countries that had been indebted to the IMF, which by extension also included many governments around the world in the global north, could then, those countries could seek debt cancellation through that initiative, the HIPC initiative. And in addition, a number of countries, including my own here in Canada, chose to cancel their own bilateral debts. So if a country owed money to Canada, Canada could wipe that clean. And in a number of cases, they did do that. So that HIPC initiative is kind of the big institutional proposal. And as I mentioned, it did achieve lots and lots of debt cancellation that was wiped from the books. I mentioned there's complications. We can get into that in a minute, but that was the big moment. And I think that that's instructive because even despite the limitations and problems with that initiative, what it did was it proved that debt can actually be canceled, which is something that creditors prior to that initiative had been saying explicitly, we can't do this. We just can't cancel it. It won't work. And in fact, in the end, they did do it. So I think that's a testament to the fact that the church can open up a certain imaginative space for how we can think differently. Maybe we can't compel states to cancel debt, but we can expand the kind of horizon of what's possible when it comes to debt. And we did that 25 years ago.
But what about for individual Catholics thinking about where debt forgiveness fits into a Jubilee year? Because there are some practices that are very clear. You make a pilgrimage to Rome, you walk through the Holy Door, you get an indulgence. In terms of thinking about debt forgiveness, what is the spiritual significance for Catholics thinking about this if it's not something that they can unilaterally do?
Right. Well, I mean, the Jubilee Year is a chance to think about how debt permeates so much of our lives. More and more people have personal debt than ever before in a place like the United States, for example. And I think that raises good questions about why. Why do we finance our healthcare with debt? Why do we finance education with debt? Why are our mortgages so high? More and more and more research, I think, has been done on that to show that we could be getting higher wages. We could be giving more in public investment in these kinds of common goods. And instead, we use private debt as a way to finance that. So I think that there's one kind of opportunity for individuals to consider their own relationship to debt. But even when it comes to these international kinds of issues, international finance, et cetera, it can feel maybe a bit alienating. But individuals have a lot of power when it comes to reshaping the international financial architecture, as some people call it. A big jargony term, but a good one, because it is a bit of an architecture. It's a big kind of schematic or a blueprint of how the economy works. And at the end of the day, individuals on our own maybe don't have a lot of power, right? I can't just on my own go talk to the Prime Minister of Canada or the President of the United States and ask them to sort this out. But as a bloc, I think we can do that. And again, that's the lesson of Jubilee 2000, is that by having so many people around the world come together in a unified campaign for debt cancellation, they did actually achieve that. And I think that's a challenge for us as individuals spiritually trying to get in touch with the Jubilee Year when we experience that special moment of grace that is offered to us through indulgences or other parts of the Jubilee Year. What does that moment commit us to do in the material world? And I think advocating for debt cancellation is just one really natural commitment that should come out of that experience.
I do think it's hard because there are, multiple opportunities that pop up during a Jubilee for some of these other devotions and practices. Like, everyone's organizing a pilgrimage to Rome or somewhere else, or your pastor's probably preaching on indulgences and how you can get one. And this is something that is a little bit more difficult, even though it is one of these like pillars of what a Jubilee year should be. I don't know if we as a church on a day-to-day level, in a parish level, have really come up with the imagination on how to live this out. It does still feel like the only thing you can do is sort of plug into some of these larger organizations that are looking at structures, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there probably are more opportunities. Would you agree?
I would agree, yeah. And I think that the pilgrimage theme is such a generative one in the Jubilee year. Pope Francis called us to be pilgrims of hope in a broad sense, which I think is important. We're trying to kind of inculcate what does it mean to be a hopeful person in a world that, when I look at it, doesn't feel very hopeful. I feel like it's a pilgrimage myself to figure out how to be hopeful and so on. And I think that there's also creative ways to use that call in order to connect the debt issue to those spiritual ideas of pilgrimage. For example, in June, I went to Calgary, a city here in Canada, nearby where the G7 countries were meeting. And the G7 was meeting to discuss issues that they thought are important to them. And we'd been lobbying to kind of get debt on the agenda. And a number of folks from Canada, but also the US and many other places, Peru, Palestine, Kenya, had made a pilgrimage to Calgary, to that particular city, to say, well, we have our own issues that we want to talk about. And we held a people's forum in parallel to that G7 meeting. And we kind of played with that pilgrimage theme to say, could we kind of join one another in making the trip to a place where global leaders are also making a trip? And those same kinds of things are happening with respect to conferences around financing for development, these big international meetings, or COP30, an environmental meeting that will happen in November in Brazil. All these kinds of moments are moments for people to make a physical kind of manifestation of their commitment to debt justice. So I think that the pilgrimage theme is actually a really interesting one, and even more locally. Maybe you can't go to Brazil or Calgary or whatever. There's also been a lot of talk around what does it mean to do a pilgrimage to a place like a bank or an embassy or some kind of decision-making entity in a city that holds the keys to debt. And what would it mean for us to have a kind of spiritual witness at a place like that? And I think that puts together that beautiful tradition of Catholics actually walking around with our faith and binding that to a kind of spiritual and political message.
I want to get more into your experience with the G7, but before we get there, we've noted how complicated this whole thing is, this international architecture around debt. So if we could do some 101 there, who are the people or countries that are in debt, and who are they getting money from?
A great and very complicated question. I will start talking about this, and you might at a certain point just have to tell me to stop talking about it. So I'm just giving you that warning up front. It is very complicated. There are dozens of countries that are in debt risk situations that are kind of measured in a variety of ways to being either very critical, which means you're spending so much money to pay back your debt that you can't invest in those key development areas like healthcare, education, climate finance, etc., to kind of moderate levels of debt risk, which you might have a ton of debt where if there's an unexpected shock in your country, like a climate event or something, that might kind of tip you over the edge. So dozens of countries are in one of those two situations.
And these are mostly countries in the developing world, I imagine.
That's right. Exactly. So across the global south, and especially in Africa, which is the continent that has the most countries that are in the most debt in particular.
Just for my own understanding, is to contrast it with like the type of debt that maybe some of the world superpowers have. Because people always talk about like the U.S. has debt, for example, but I imagine it's a very different situation than some of these other countries that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there is a kind of qualitative difference between the sovereign debt of a country like the US or Canada or many European countries and the debt that's owed by countries in the global south. And there are a few reasons. One is that if you're the United States, you borrow in your own currency, in US dollars. And that makes a huge difference, because if you're not the US, let's say you're, I don't know, Zambia or something, and you take out a huge loan, that loan will probably also be in US dollars. But if you're Zambia, you don't make US dollars. You make a local currency, and that currency fluctuates in terms of its value relative to the US dollar, right? Currency exchanges and so on. And so what happens is, when the US is in debt using its own currency, the debt is a bit more stable. Worst case scenario, the US can print more US dollars. There's problems with that too, but it can do that. It has the sovereignty to do that. If you're Zambia, you can't just print more US dollars. And the kinds of ways that you make US dollars are tied to things like exports in your economy. In Zambia's case, copper. If the copper price really fluctuates a ton, then you're going to have less US dollars coming in, which means less money to pay off your loan in US dollars. So that's one kind of structural example, a bit complex, but important. Another is that many countries in the North, their debts are quite big. And I think there's good critical questions to ask about that. But they're often indebted mostly to themselves. Like here in Canada, most of our debt is domestic debt. We have some external debt, but we owe ourselves money, our own banks and so on. And we're going to pay ourselves back over time. That's just part of the economy. If your debt is really heavily external, you owe it somewhere else, that really reduces the space that you have to kind of maneuver and negotiate and work out what's good for your country. You can't have that same kind of conversation. You can't pass regulations, etc., that might kind of help draw down that debt burden. There's a ton more technical kind of reasons why the debt would be more burdensome in the South, but those are just a few. And I think it's a good question to ask, because some people will say, well, every country's in debt, and so why do these countries need debt cancellation and the US doesn't, for example? And I think it's important to recognize that the situation is so unique, so different, that those countries will not be able to get out from underneath their debt without a pretty heavy intervention, in a way that is not true for the North.
And the debt crisis is often talked about in terms of like a parallel development crisis. Because correct me if I'm wrong, but in theory, the governments are taking these loans in order to invest in their people and infrastructure and healthcare and that sort of thing. So is that what's happening, or what's keeping that from being like a virtuous cycle where they take these loans, they invest, and they become less impoverished?
Exactly. And I think that's exactly the right question to ask. There was a great report from the Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences last year that had such a good way of phrasing it, where they said these days countries are not defaulting on their debt. They keep paying the debt. They're defaulting on development, which is to say, as I mentioned earlier, they're taking dollars that should go to healthcare, education, production, whatever, and sending that out to foreign creditors. And I think that's a good way to frame it. They're defaulting on development, not defaulting on debt. And I think that that's an important way to frame it, because at the end of the day, all the money that's going out of a country is money that's not going back into its own citizens. And when we talk too about how loans are used, this is maybe a long story too, but after the 2008 financial crisis, interest rates in the global North basically went to zero. And in order to make money, if you make money by giving out loans, you've got to find a place with higher interest rates. And where can you give those rates? Usually to countries in the South that need a ton of capital and don't have it. So there was tons of borrowing that happened after the financial crisis. And it was often borrowed at really high rates with kind of short-term thinking, like a really short influx of cash. And development is not a short-term thing. I mean, if you're investing in education, you're investing in somebody's 0 or 5 to 18-year-old life or whatever, and then maybe they go to college and so on. Like, the returns of an investment in something like education are not going to materialize within a couple of decades even. And yet you're going to have to pay that loan back pretty quickly. So, it is a bit of a predatory system. And now that loans have ballooned even more since that period in 2008, we're seeing, I think, a continued default on that development.
And is there blame to go around there? Because I think obviously you can be a predatory lender, but in a lot of cases, I'm sure that people in charge in some of these countries that are borrowing are knowingly taking on debt that they know is going to be problematic, probably for some short-sighted political gains, for example.
No doubt. I mean, debt is a two-way street. Loans are a two-way street. They are supposed to be, in theory, spaces of mutual risk, right? The creditor is giving money assuming that they'll get paid back, ideally. I mean, they do want that. They want to be paid back. And debtors, too, are taking a loan assuming they'll be able to pay it back. That's the ideal situation. And can debtors make a bad bet? Definitely, absolutely. And do they make bad bets? Yes. There's irresponsible lending, and some people take that irresponsible loan. That's true. But I think that when we talk about that mutuality in our global financial system, even though the risk is theoretically mutual, materially, it really is not. It's the debtor who always loses. The debtor is always on the hook to pay back. If you are a corporation or a person and you're in trouble with debt, you can declare bankruptcy, restructure that debt, and find a way to reset your financial life. If you're a country, there is no international mechanism to do that, which essentially means the creditors always win. The creditors are guaranteed, unless they choose out of the goodness of their hearts to restructure or cancel a debt. There's nothing that compels them to release that debt burden. So even though there might be a kind of shared irresponsibility at the time of making the loan, the risks and consequences are not shared in a mutual way. And there's a huge power imbalance there.
And I think there's a worldview assumption here that I would hope most Catholics have, but it's important to say out loud, which is one, inequality is bad, right? At a certain level, and especially to the degrees in which we're seeing it on the global scale. It's bad morally, but I also get the sense that more countries and economists are realizing that, in some ways the borders that we've constructed are artificial. And when one country suffers, that could cause a massive migration crisis, and then they show up on our borders, and now we have a domestic migration problem here in the United States, for example. So it seems counterproductive to enforce a lot of these debt lending situations where you're crushing a country's ability to develop those problems. Even if you're getting payment on interest, these problems are only going to come back to bite you in the end. Do I have that right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the key message, I think, of something like Laudato Si, right? That everything is interconnected, and what happens in one place is not disconnected from what happens elsewhere. And we see that in the international financial system, especially when there's a problem in the global south. I think, for a while, global north countries can kind of feel like they're insulated from that problem, or they can say that's not really our problem. But lots and lots of things, lots of other problems materialize from that. I mean, you mentioned people on the move is a big one. That's a huge challenge. How does the world, ensure that move either can happen with dignity or doesn't have to happen out of a compulsion? It should be a free choice to immigrate, not a feeling of compulsion. But other things too, like securities, countries that have huge amounts of inequality or don't have a lot of economic sovereignty. They can't invest in climate kinds of adaptation and mitigation. These things have lots of knock-on effects, like the increase of violent conflict and the erosion of peace. And I think what we see is that, again, these things are not disconnected. And the more we pretend that they are, the more we're basically kind of waiting to find out when the problem gets to our shores, not being able to kind of put it off forever.
Mm. So we have these international institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, that I guess in theory are supposed to fix this situation. But, you mentioned 2000, we had this big debt relief, and some of the countries that had their debt canceled are now 25 years later back in a bad situation. So what's malfunctioning at the international level?
Right. Well, the kind of makeup of the debt landscape is actually quite different now than in 2000. In 2000, one reason the HIPC initiative happened at the IMF is that a lot of that debt that was creating such a huge burden was owed to the IMF and to what we could call public or official creditors. So other governments, public kinds of holders of credit. These days, overwhelmingly, the majority of debt is held actually by private creditors. who can be anything from a bank to a bondholder to, your pension fund might be actually invested in sovereign debt through an asset management company like BlackRock or something like that. So there's a more diverse, more complex set of creditors. And while public creditors are ostensibly accountable to you and me, to the public, private creditors are not. They're accountable to shareholders, to their own profit margins, and so on. And one strange thing that we're seeing is when a country is in a huge debt crisis and they can't pay back the private creditor that they have a relationship with, what we see is the IMF and the World Bank, they essentially will loan, again, money to that country to pay back their private loans, which is basically a huge bailout structure. So public money is getting funneled through that process into private creditor bank accounts, and then the country just ends up being indebted to the IMF and World Bank, which is, not a good recipe if you want to deal with the kind of structural cycles of debt crises. We're kind of just actually allowing them to continue rather than stopping them, which is, as you rightly point out, the IMF and World Bank should be organizing all that stuff for development, but as it stands, they are not.
So practically, I don't know, you can't just wave a magic wand and make these banks just forget about their self-interest and forgive these debts. And even if they could, there are going to be knock-on effects for the U.S. economy if that happens. So in practice, what would it look like for these banks to forgive debt?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is actually not being able to get all the creditors at the same table. I think some debt probably should just be canceled outright and it would be fine. There are many loans where the principal has been paid back, interest has been paid back, and now these countries are basically just giving out free money. And that is unjust. Those kinds of loans ought to go. But not every loan is like that. And at the end of the day, many countries aren't even asking. No country is really standing in front of the UN and saying, we would like you to erase all the debt that we have. That's not a demand from anybody. What they are asking for is a clear and universal process by which private and public creditors can all come together in one place and they can hash it out and say what makes sense here, what's fair, and what will allow a country to actually end up in a sustainable economic situation. The big proposal from civil society, and it's one that also Pope Francis had suggested last year, is that there ought to be a kind of mechanism to work out debt crises housed at the United Nations, a democratic space. So not housed within creditors like the IMF or the World Bank or kind of private lending schemes, but held in a place where it's one country, one vote, and we can all have a bit of a discussion about what that mechanism should look like. So you're right. It's not as simple as saying we'll wave the magic wand and nothing bad will happen. But I think in order to mitigate all the potential interests and especially the real interest of people who are suffering under the burden of debt, we need one space that everybody agrees to come to where we can sort out what ought to happen.
I think some people might be listening and think the church's involvement is such that we just stand off in the corner and say, look, everybody play nice. We don't really get the finer details of how all this works, but we just know that it's unjust and we want it to be just, which is nice, but a little naive. I think they'd be surprised to find out that a lot of the proposed solutions are being developed in conjunction with some Vatican offices, with some Caritas offices, like the one you're working for in Canada. Could you give a broad overview of the church's current involvement in this?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked because I agree. I think people don't understand that the church is really trying everything, I think, to push this forward. And I've been so kind of pleasantly surprised by all the things the church can try, which we've discovered through this campaign.
Despite being in debt, in our own ways at the Vatican.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I guess that'll be the next campaign. I don't know who could say. But, it's true. The Holy See has representation at the United Nations, for example. And over the course of 2025 and even in 2024, there's been an ongoing process at the UN to think about how do we finance development. And in that process, the Holy See has consistently made really, really powerful interventions about the necessity of debt forgiveness to finance development and reshape the debt structures that we have to make development more substantial. So there's a diplomatic piece there that I think is really unique and important. In addition to that, the Vatican released a report this year by a group of experts that the Vatican commissioned, a Jubilee group. And they put out a report with lots of technical recommendations, the kinds of things that if you were a person who worked at the IMF or the World Bank, that'd be the kind of thing you'd want to see. What are some actual kind of boring economic details that I need in order to think about how does this translate to policy? And then, of course, there's the civil society piece, or kind of the social movement piece, which is kind of where I'm coming from, where, as you say, Caritas Internationalis and many other Catholic actors are thinking through how do we leverage what it means to be a person who goes to Mass, who participates in a parish, who is running around many other places in my city, in a place like Toronto, New York, London, whatever, especially in the global north. And how do I kind of take responsibility for my country's relationship to the debt crisis? And we've developed a big petition that, in fact, you can go sign. Maybe we'll plug it at the very end. But it's a petition that has 3 big asks. And in summary, they're basically cancel unjust and unsustainable debt, change the rules of the system, and establish that mechanism at the United Nations. So the church is doing it all. I mean, they're talking at the UN, they're calling experts together, they're getting all the rabble out to, go harass their politicians or, hold a vigil or whatever it might be. And it's not like all those things have kind of come together into one totally effective strategy that has achieved debt cancellation so far. But I do think the church is not leaving any tools on the table, and that's really inspiring.
The talk of forgiveness kind of puts the rich countries, the creditors, as this in this role of being benefactors. They're doing this out of the goodness of their hearts. But you mentioned this idea of unjust loans, and so we were talking a lot about what these countries owe their creditors. But I think what the Catholic Church would ask us to do is ask yourself, what do we owe them?
Exactly. I think that is the right way to frame it. And it's the way that Pope Francis often framed it. And I'm certain Pope Leo will as well. It's the way that John Paul II framed it. And it's to say that there's a kind of even deeper debt that we all owe each other, right? That we are kind of indebted to one another. We have the debt of being kind and good and generous and just to one another. And the economic debt actually subverts that more important, more primordial debt. And Pope Francis even added another wrinkle that I've really appreciated, which is to say that even though the North demands the financial debt be paid by the South, there's also an ecological debt that the global North owes to the global South. And this is something he was saying as far back as Laudato Si, that because of our contributions to carbon emissions and our supply chains and all these kinds of things, we actually find ourselves in a kind of moral debt and moral obligation and a material debt as well to the people of the South. So I think that there's a lot of room to kind of explore a Catholic moral vocabulary when we try to think what do we really owe one another?
When I was struck by some of Francis's writing about, even the Our Father creates an imagination for Christians where, we say, forgive us our, we typically say it as trespasses, but I think debt is actually a closer, forgive us our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us, is a crucial part of the prayer that we say. And there's almost this a reminder that, God doesn't owe us anything, and yet he gives us so much. And our entire logic around mercy is such that it's illogical, right? God does not demand repayment for the sins we've committed. I'm curious, in your own spirituality, if that's something you've prayed with or reflected on.
Yeah, and I think it is really generative and powerful and convicting even to think we've been the recipients of so much grace. And what does that actually mean for our own behavior in the world? How can we multiply, amplify, proliferate that grace in our relationships with others and also in our kind of structural relationships? I mean, we live in an economy that is basically organized around the opposite principle, that grace is not actually the way that you should kind of run a business. For sure, you would go out of business. It's not the way you should run a national economy and so on. But it's the kind of thing that ought to kind of motivate us to ask those deeper, more structural, critical questions.
Well, Dean, thank you so much for sharing this wisdom with us. I imagine it's really hard to tackle such a huge, complicated problem. So the fact that you've been working on this through Caritas is really admirable. But before we let you go back to your job, we do have one final question that we ask all of our guests, and that is if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
Wow, what a tough question. And I should have known it was coming because I have listened to this podcast enough times to have expected it. But believe it or not, I didn't even think twice about it. The easy answer is Pope Francis, and I would default to it, but I feel like it's an easy way out. So you know who I'll say, and this will be a good provocative note to end on, but it would be Ernesto Cardenal, a priest and poet in Nicaragua, who's a hero of mine and somebody that I often find myself reading, especially his poetry, when I feel like I need a little bit of belief that the world could be different. Cardinal's the person I go to.
And someone who Pope Francis rehabilitated, is that correct?
Exactly, that's right.
All right, we'll link to that story in our show notes. And Dean, we'll also link to the petition that you mentioned. And anything else you want to plug?
That's it. Sign this petition, take it to your pastor, take it to your parish, get it signed by your parishioners, become the annoying person at your family reunion who's like, you got to sign this document and report the signatures. And I'll just say at the end, I think that is essential because it allows us to show decision makers that this isn't just an issue that's important to technical experts and economists, but it's important to those of us as people of faith. And the more signatures we have that prove that, the better case we can make for debt cancellation.
Awesome. Dean, thanks so much for, I feel smarter. So thank you for teaching me. I know our listeners would appreciate that too.
Yeah. Thank you, Dean. And now we have As One Friend Speaks to Another, the part of our show where we talk about where we're finding God in our lives and share stories of faith from across the Catholic Church. What do you have this week, Zach? Anything big going on?
Not a lot going on. No, they say there's that saying there's no atheists in foxholes. I think that was about parenthood primarily before it was applied to warfare. When Madeline was born, a friend texted me and said, hope that you're like this first week you can just sort of take it, like bask in wonder and awe. Those verbs like wonder, awe, those are nouns.
It's okay. You're a dad.
Yeah. And
keep rolling.
Basking.
Rolling with it.
That really is kind of like what that first month, the best parts of that first month of parenthood, just staring at the baby. And I could stare at the baby, do nothing for hours on end. But when I was thinking about what I wanted to share with the podcast, I was thinking about how caring for someone, that's totally dependent upon you, it reveals your own weaknesses, or at least it is in me. It you sort of feel inadequate, like it sort of brings out all the things you can't do or you don't know. And I was thinking that obviously there's an evil spirit. The evil spirit could take that and run with it and say, you're not good enough. You're going to screw up this kid. You don't know how to do this. But also I think it should teach us about what, I don't know, authority or communion is actually like, right? I don't have me caring for this child. Does that mean I just have absolute power over it and lord it over it? And I'm like some king that's going to lord over this child while it grows up. I think revealing the weaknesses that I have reminds me that one, it takes help. It does take a village, and I've had a really good one, yourself included. And also that we love each other in our weakness. And I think that says a lot about community and communion too, right? I don't know. That's sort of I don't always fall on that good interpretation of it. There are plenty of times, often at 3 a.m. where I am thinking that I can't.
Why can I not keep this baby from crying?
Yep. Just go back to sleep, please. I would like to go back to sleep. We're all going to be happier if we all go back to sleep. But on my good days, that's sort of the approach I'm taking in my prayer.
All right. That's beautiful. And I'll get us out of here. Jesuitical is made by us, Sebastian Gomes, Will Gualtieri, and Kevin Christopher Robles. Faith formation provided by Father Eric Sundrup, SJ. Don't forget to subscribe, follow, or like on whatever platform you're on. You can support Jesuitical by subscribing to America Magazine at americamagazine.org. I'm Ashley McKinless with Zac Davis. We'll see you next week.